Very glad to welcome you all here. I could ask people perhaps to move in a little closer, and so just consider what I have asked you. I'm glad Rabbi Gold, you listen as you always do to my request. My name is David Ellenson. I'm the president of the Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, and I suppose on this evening, when we not only celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Torah translation, but also the life of our teacher, Dr. Orlinsky, Harry Orlinsky, that the Jewish Institute of Religion part should be particularly emphasized. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the College Institute. I will indicate that I have been a student of Dr. Orlinsky's in the 1970s. He was truly an unforgettable teacher. I do remember very, very vividly at 40 West 68th Street, where the college was located at that point, that the JPS Bible translation team would meet at the Jewish Institute of Religion during those days. And I have a very vivid memory, I suppose I can say this, of everyone else on the Torah translation committee wearing a yarmulke, they were all men, with one exception, Harry Orlinsky. And I also have a vivid memory of them sitting downstairs as they were all engaging in the Keynote at the end of lunch with Dr. Orlinsky, rifling through his briefcase during that period, not engaging in the Birkat zone with his colleagues. I would say that he, in that setting, was steadfastly, I'm not sure, secular perhaps might be the word. I have so many stories from his years, and he was really an inimitable teacher, a very, very serious scholar. I know we're going to hear a great deal about him tonight in terms of his writings on the Septuagint. He was the individual that David Ben-Gurion had commissioned on the part of the Israeli government to authenticate the Dead Sea Scrolls. I presume we're going to hear a great deal about his life in all those ways. What I remember him doing the most is always coming into class with his raincoat on, throwing it somewhere in the classroom, and then the first 20 to 30 minutes, I would say, reading his mail and commenting on it to us. I see that my colleague, Rabbi Leonard, is here tonight. He was very proud of Lenny, who had written a senior thesis on the book of Job as a legal drama under Dr. Orlinsky's direction, and we heard a great deal about what his childhood was like in Toronto, his years at Proxy College, Dr. Rivkin, Dr. Zeitlin, and others, his years in Baltimore at Hopkins and the Hebrew College. And we got to know a great many characters with whom he had acquaintance during his lifetime. He loved his family infinitely, and we heard about all of him having children in a way that only a proud parent would describe his or her children. And I think those of us who were students loved him very dearly. In my office, I have two pictures. One is of Dr. Fritz Van Leer, and the other is of Dr. Orlinsky, and I keep it on my shelf. One story he told me, and I think I'll just end with this as we move on tonight. I will never forget that there was a professor who had written a book, and he was extremely critical in class of the professor's work. But at that point, he then read us a review that he had written of this professor's work in the Journal of the American Oriental Society, and was fulsome in praise. I have no idea how the academics here would respond to this. And I asked him, I said, well, Dr. Orlinsky, how is it that you can have a negative view of this man's scholarship, but in your work for the scholarly community, you write only positive? I will never forget, he said, well, David, you should never let your scholarship interfere with your values. Dr. Orlinsky, and I leave this to Bible scholars here. He said, most of my scholars in Bible, colleagues in Bible are, and you can hear your father saying this, but bit of a Yiddish inflection, anti-Semitic. And he said, this particular man is an Ohev Yisrael. He loves the Jewish people, and he loves the state of Israel. He said, I would never write a critical word about him. And I have never forgotten that. And since I do have the floor, I'll tell you one more story. When I was in my second year of rabbinical school, I had written an article on Emil Fackenheim called Emil Fackenheim, the Revealed Morality of Judaism, and I discussed Martin Buber in this article. It was published while I was a second or third year rabbinic student in Judaism. And in only the way a young graduate student could do it, I did make a comment that if Emil Fackenheim had better understood Buber, he might not have made a mistake. In my opinion, it's his interpretation. Dr. Orlinsky came into class and said, there have been many, many teachers throughout time who have been extremely blessed, particularly when you have students who is so brilliant that they're able to speak about an expert in Jewish thought while they are still a graduate student. My friend is a very, very famous author, and they're able to provide correction. He said, you know, Ashreinu, how happy we are in our Beit Midrash that we have such a student. And then he went on to say, that student was David Ellenson. I was blushing as this was going on. He then went on to say in tones that I've never forgotten. I was just in Dr. Klaskow's class and talking about how it is that teachers interact with students and how one creates community. I don't know what our current students say about this. And Dr. Orlinsky said, you know, I grew up, my native language is Yiddish, English. He said, I read German as well as I read these two languages. But I have to confess that I have really never understood Martin Buber. He said, I appreciated Buber. He was a Zionist, and he told people to go make Aliyah, Eretz Yisrael, as he put it. But he said, it may well be that other people have the same problem with Martin Buber that I have. He said, probably when those young Germans read Buber's work, they actually just couldn't get to the end and understand it. So the conclusion where he said, and now make Aliyah to Israel, they never got to it. So he said that may explain why they never made Aliyah. But he said, I really am blessed, because he said, I have a student who understands Buber so well that he's able to correct an expert in the field in terms of his understanding. At that point, he read a section in Buber, and he said, David, you have such expertise. This passage in Martin Buber. And I said, well, Dr. Orlinsky, I actually cannot. And then he said to me again in his inimitable style, but just remember, the next time you offer, particularly public criticism, you should do so with perhaps a bit more humility. And then he said, if you'd like to watch a Yankees game with me, I'm happy to do it. The truth is, I think there were many of us who loved Harry Orlinsky. He was, as you'll hear tonight, a great, great scholar. But I think, as his student, what I genuinely loved was his humanity. He was literally bigger than life. And I think for all of us who were his students, we felt genuinely blessed and privileged to be in his presence. We are very, very happy to welcome the Jewish Publication Society here tonight to mark the 50th anniversary of this epic translation. Rabbi Schwartz, we're very privileged to be able to engage, co-sponsor this evening with you. All of you are certainly welcome back here many times, and I look forward to the comments that Dr. Greenspoon, Rabbi Schwartz, and Dr. Sperling will make on Dr. Orlinsky tonight. Again, we welcome the Orlinsky family and are happy that so many of you are out here on this evening to commemorate this epic translation, to honor the Jewish Publication Society, and to remember the memory and celebrate the memory of our teacher, Steve Harry Orlinsky. Thank you.
Erev Tov and good evening, and Chag Urim Sameach, happy Hanukkah to everybody. On behalf of the Jewish Publication Society, thank you all for being here. Thank you to President David Ellenson, who when I first proposed this gathering said simply and immediately, yes, we will make it happen. How wonderful to be back at HUC-JIR, my alma mater as well, to the very place where I was ordained 27 years ago, and to see distinguished faculty and colleagues and guests. How wonderful to honor a translation and a translator, the epic work of my larger-than-life teacher of Bible, Harry Orlinsky, on the 50th anniversary of the JPS Torah, the 20th anniversary of Professor Orlinsky's passing, now during the 90th anniversary of the JIR's founding. I want to acknowledge the presence of Professor Orlinsky's family who are here today. Harry's son, Zeke Orlinsky, is here with his wife, Ellen, and her daughter and son-in-law, Jennifer and Adam. Harry's grandson, Eric Orlinsky, is here with his mother, Joanne. Eric's father was Harry's son, the late Wally Orlinsky. We are also blessed to have at least 3 of Harry's great-grandchildren with us, Rachel, Charlie, and Lexi. Would you stand so we could applaud? I'd also like to acknowledge the president of the Jewish Publication Society, David Leonard, the director of development, Sarah Kroloff-Siegel, Donna Scher, the director of the University of Nebraska Press, our new publishing partner, and members of our board who are present. Would those individuals please stand so we can recognize you? This coming year marks the 125th anniversary of our founding in 1888, and JPS is proud to continue serving the Jewish community as the oldest not-for-profit and truly trans-denominational Jewish publisher in the United States. Allow me just a few additional words about the organization that I have loved since I was a child and now have the privilege of leading. These are tumultuous times for publishers, but I am happy to report that the Jewish Publication Society has received a new lease on life with its partnership with the University of Nebraska Press. We are continuing our mission to publish books of enduring worth, books of accessible scholarship, books that will stand the test of time. In the tradition of our classics like the JPS Tanakh, the JPS Bible Commentary Series, the JPS Mikra Gedolot, Legends of the Jews, Folk Tales of the Jews, the Jewish catalogs, and next year, a monumental 3-volume anthology of Second Temple literature, outside the Bible, ancient Jewish writings related to Scripture. A decade in the making, with 70 scholars from around the world. I invite you to take hot off the press some preview pages to that anthology this evening. All these projects rely on the generosity of donors who believe in our mission and members of our board who articulate our vision. Please learn more about JPS, which I consider to be the best kept secret in the Jewish community for the last century and a half. Nothing would please me more than to talk to you about an opportunity to serve or to support. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, a learned and humorous man in the tradition of Harry Orlinsky, a man who calls Orlinsky his mentor and himself has become a recognized authority on Jewish translations of the Bible. A native of Richmond, Virginia, Dr. Leonard Greenspoon holds the Klutznick Chair in Jewish Civilization at Creighton University. On the Creighton faculty since 1995, he is also professor of classical and Near Eastern studies and theology. From his days as a graduate student at Harvard University, from which he received his Ph.D. in Near Eastern languages and civilization, Greenspoon has been interested in translations of the Bible. Many of his publications, he has edited or authored 20 books, written more than 200 articles and book chapters, and penned almost 300 book reviews, deal with aspects of this fascinating subject. He has written on topics ranging from the earliest translations of the Bible, the Septuagint, to versions of the Bible composed as recently as last year. He is recognized internationally as an expert in the history of Jewish Bible translations and has been involved as an editor or a consultant in 2 Bible translation projects. In his research and writing, Greenspoon is especially interested in the way Bible translators, acting as individuals, or more often as members of a committee, reflect the historical, social, cultural, and political, as well as religious environments in which they work. And we'll be hearing about this theme shortly. He also focuses on how specific Bible translations influence the communities for which they were invented or intended, and how later translators and commentators make use of earlier versions. He is at present completing a long-awaited book on the history of Jewish Bible translations for the American Bible Society, and we hope for JPS as well. We welcome from Omaha, Nebraska, Professor Leonard Greenspoon.
Thank you very much. Before I start my prepared remarks, I should say something which will seem rather strange, because I saw Wally and Zeke grow up, and how was that possible? Because Orlinsky's letters, as they were filled with all kinds of information about biblical scholarship and biblical scholars, they were also filled with a lot of information about his family. And so I followed tonsils and all kinds of appendectomies, whatever the operations were, over the years that almost chronicled the family's health problems and their trips and everything else. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity, hopefully afterwards, to get to know you outside of this epistolary format. I should also add that Ellenson belonged to a generation, alas, I think almost at its end, that wrote letters, actual typed and handwritten letters, endlessly. And now at the archives in Cincinnati, his letters have been organized. They were much more fun when they weren't organized, just to sort of go through. And there are hundreds upon hundreds of letters. And a colleague of mine who also has an HUC connection, Jason Coleman, who's in Cincinnati, and I are editing the letters between Harry Orlinsky and William F. Albright, who was the best-known Protestant biblical scholar of his generation. And we're not lacking for wonderful information, but I think we're going to have trouble with deciding what to cut. Anyway, it is a pleasure to be here, and I should add that I didn't go to HUC, and I'm not ordained, but hopefully I'm acceptable. I do not believe that any English translation of the Hebrew Bible meant for the reader of today has the right to retain obsolete Old English forms and endings. He stated emphatically, the style and vocabulary of any new JPS translation must be simplified and modernized without undue loss of majesty and dignity. At the same time, it is my opinion that Jews generally should use a translation which relies on Jewish scholarly opinion. These are unmistakably the words of Harry M. Orlinsky. In this instance, they were uttered in early May of 1953 at a meeting of the Jewish Publication Society. At the age of 45, Orlinsky was a professor at the recently merged Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. Handpicked by JIR founder and president Stephen S. Wise, Orlinsky had already established a formidable reputation as a Jewish biblical scholar in what was still predominantly a Protestant field. The title of Orlinsky's presentation on that occasion wanted a new version of the Bible for the Jewish people, aptly summarized his goal that day. For some time before the event, he had been adamantly arguing for a new English language edition of the Hebrew Bible, prepared by Jews and for Jews, that would take the place of the earlier JPS translation of 1917. No one was better prepared than Orlinsky to make the case and to be the leader and have a pivotal role in carrying out the project. When Orlinsky was Canadian-born, completed his undergraduate work at the University of Toronto, he determined to continue his studies at Philadelphia's Dropsy College, in particular to work with Professor Max L. Margolis. As it happened, and as Orlinsky knew well, Margolis had been the editor-in-chief of the 1917 version. A young Orlinsky arrived in Philadelphia in the fall of 1931 and immediately began his studies with Margolis and other Protestant faculty. Alas, after a very short period of time, Margolis fell ill and had to leave the classroom, never to return. He died in early 1932. Although the time they spent together was unfortunately very brief, Margolis' influence on Orlinsky was profound. Like his revered teacher, Orlinsky specialized in the Septuagint, the Greek text that was the earliest translation of the Hebrew Bible. And like Margolis, Orlinsky took an interest and active role in Bible translating. In Orlinsky's case, his participation in Bible translation can justly be termed groundbreaking. During the decade of the 1940s, he had participated as a member of the committee that produced the Revised Standard Version. He was the first Jewish scholar to participate in a Bible version otherwise prepared by and primarily for Christians. Later, he was instrumental in the new Revised Standard Version, which appeared in 1990. Again, he was the only Jewish scholar asked to participate. The call for a new JPS version at the midpoint of the 20th century was timely. The earlier JPS translation had served English-speaking Jews well for almost half a century. But it was not simply the passage of a certain amount of years that motivated Orlinsky's call for a new Jewish version. Rather, he knew as well as anyone that during the intervening years, that is between 1917 and the 50s, biblical scholarship had made substantial advances toward a better understanding of the biblical text. This was true of linguistics, grammar, and stylistic interpretation, as well as from the side of archaeology, paleography, and comparative religion. But there was more. A conscientious reader of the 1917 translation, which is the translation that most of us who are of a certain age grew up with, could not fail to observe that it looked and sounded very much like the King James Version. That was not by chance. Margolis, who was himself an immigrant from Lithuania, felt that the diction of the King James Version would serve as an appropriate model for teaching English to immigrant Jews. Imagine immigrant Jews learning to speak in the King James Version. But this was an optimist. And so Margolis saw his work in terms of instruction in language as well as in theology. In this regard, Margolis consciously modeled himself on the example of Moses Mendelssohn, the Jewish Enlightenment leader who in the late 1700s produced a Bible rendering in German to replace earlier Yiddish translations for a community that was now able to join polite society, but only if they abandoned the acouthness of Yiddish for the elevation of proper German. There are many positive features that speak in favor of making use of King James type language and diction in the Bible translation. It is for that reason that the King James version and its progeny continue to be bestsellers in the huge market that today constitutes Bible translations and commentaries. At the same time, it must be admitted that it is not an easy task for a modern reader to get through a chapter or more of the King James Version, given that its style, diction, and vocabulary reflect the 16th rather than the 21st century. For Orlinsky, the antiquated nature of the King James Version was not charming, nor was it suitable. Quite the contrary. It contradicted what was for him the primary function of the translator of the Hebrew Bible, namely to make the text intelligible for those who are not able to read the Hebrew in its original. For this goal, a translator needed to carefully gauge the style of English with which members of his or her audience were comfortable. The translation that would result from this approach would look and read like any other piece of literature contemporary with the translator's audience. And this is indeed how the JPS translation that first appeared in 1962 was intended to function. For many years, the difference between a translation like JPS 1917 and the new JPS were subsumed under the broad categories of literal and free, respectively. While there is certainly some truth in these designations, they are not necessarily the best way to characterize these approaches. Today, it is more usual to use the terms formal and functional. A formal translation is more literal because every effort is made to preserve the form of the original in the new rendering. A functional translation tends to be freer because the basic questions asked, what meaning were the original authors trying to convey to their audience, and how do we say that today, typically lead to renderings that are natural sounding to the new audience. Because Biblical Hebrew and American English are such different languages, a formal English translation will often sound foreign. A functional rendering will sound much more like natural English, but much less like the original Hebrew. Harry Orlinsky was the primary proponent of functional translation within the Jewish community during the second half of the 20th century. Within the larger community of biblical translators, he was joined by members of the American Bible Society, who produced the Good News Bible and later the Contemporary English Version. And these were all Protestant scholars. It is almost certain that Orlinsky's contacts with translators from the American Bible Society were decisive in marking his changed views on the direction contemporary Bible translating should take. So, for example, we have a letter he wrote in 1951, 2 years before the JPS address that we started with, and he was writing it to one of his colleagues on the RSV, Revised Standard Version Committee. And again, all of his colleagues were Christian. And he writes, I have been approached by the Jewish Publication Society with regard to the possibility of revising their translation of the Hebrew Bible. It is my opinion that their present English translation, that is the 1917 version, should be used as the basic Bible, as the basic text, in the manner that we have been operating in our revision of the American version that was the basis for the Revised Standard Version. So when Orlinsky spoke of our revision, he was speaking of the RSV. But while the RSV retained distinctive features of the King James Version, Orlinsky's, what he projected and what came out with the new JPS version was decidedly not that. And it is to Harry Orlinsky that we owe the overall look, feel, and sound of this new JPS version. And I invite you to consider not just the translation itself, but the format. In traditional Bible translations, there are two columns. And where else do you find two columns? You find them in textbooks and telephone books, maybe more telephone books. Mostly we expect the text to go straight across. And the new JPS version has the text going straight across. So a functional translation, an updated translation in modern language, not only has the language, but it has a lot of other factors which let you know that this is something which is, we might say, audience friendly. General readers of a Bible translation who are not scholars will nonetheless quickly discern whether they are looking at a formal or a functional version. With respect to the Hebrew Bible, phrases such as, and it came to pass, and behold, and constructions such as and Moses came, and he saw the burning bush, and he wondered what to do, but on and on. These are signs that you're looking at a formal equivalence. Subordinate structure, although, when, after, and easily recognizable vocabulary alert readers to the functional nature of the version. There is yet another way to look at the difference between formal and functional that can be expressed spatially. With a formal translation, the reader must move toward the text. This movement is necessary to bridge the gap between the modern reader and the ancient text. With a functional equivalence translation, which is what the JPS is, we can say that the text moves toward the reader. This is a result of the translator's decision to minimize foreign elements in the text as a means of making it more immediately intelligible to the reader. Nonetheless, at first thought, it would seem that the formal translation with this literal approach would always be more accurate than a functional translation. Not surprisingly, Harry Orlinsky argued against this view. He pointed to a number of biblical passages where the functional rendering conveyed what was in his mind the actual meaning of the Hebrew original, while the formal or literal translation misrepresented what the Hebrew meant. In order to give some specific examples of what I've been talking about, I'll just go through a couple of passages with the first rendering from the 1917 translation JPS, which looks and sounds very much like the King James, and the second coming from the New Version. So Deuteronomy 17:6 in the traditional. At the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall he that is worthy of death be put to death. But at the mouth of 1 witness he shall not be put to death. Seems reasonable. But no, here's the new translation. A person shall be put to death only on the testimony of 2 or more witnesses. He must not be put to death on the testimony of a single witness. As Orlinsky observed, the traditional translation, and I quote, by rendering shlosha, which means 3, by rendering it here literally, rather than idiomatically, is misleading. Because it says at the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses. So what about 4 witnesses? That wouldn't work? Well, of course, it would work. So by translating it idiomatically, Orlinsky feels he's got the right translation, while the literal translation misleads. In Judges 12:6, the traditional translation has a man who had 30 sons and 30 daughters he sent abroad, and 30 daughters he brought in from abroad for his sons. The new translation, he had 30 sons, and he married off 30 daughters outside the clan, and brought in 30 girls from outside the clan for his sons. As Orlinsky often remarked, although I'm going to paraphrase this, Ibsen, who is the he of this passage, was not sending his daughters off to seek husbands on the Riviera, or seeking wives for his sons from similarly exotic locales. Outside the clan ain't that exotic. In Jeremiah 31, also found in Ezekiel 18, we have the traditional rendering. In those days they shall say no more. The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are on edge. But everyone shall die for his own iniquity. Every man that eateth the sour grapes, his teeth shall be set on edge. And in the new JPS, in those days they shall no longer say, the parents have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. But all shall die for their own sins. The teeth of everyone who eats sour grapes shall be set on edge. In some of the changes we've been looking at, it is possible to detect movement in the direction of gender-neutral or gender-sensitive rendering, as in the change from father to parents. Not surprisingly, Orlinsky had definite views on this and similar practices, views that he expressed in his characteristically forthright manner in both private and public communication. Here are 2 examples with which people are less likely to be familiar because they come from his letters. Both of these letters are written to Bruce Metzger, Princeton theologian, who was the head of the new Revised Standard Version Committee that Orlinsky was also involved in. In the first letter, which dates to 1980, Orlinsky is responding to Metzger's request that people vote, and this is what you'd be voting on, to request that steps be taken to assure that additional scholars with feminist perspectives become regular members of the NRSV committee. Orlinsky responded, I am unhappy with the last sentence, with feminist perspectives. My reaction is, to hell with such perspectives. Either we are competent philologians, textual critics, and stylists, with balanced judgment and relatively even temperament, or we are unacceptable as members of a team of translators. Such perspectives as feminists are, to my mind, extraneous, and even begin to smack of a form of prior censorship. You know well, he continues, that I led the fight in the New Revised Standard Version in the work on Psalm, particularly Psalm 1. Traditionally, happy is the man. And the translation that appears in the NRSV is, blessed are those. And he said, I didn't do this because of any feminist perspectives, but because the correct understanding of the Hebrew text demanded it. More recently, he continued, in my considerable revision of Leviticus, I have proposed the elimination of male-oriented language, man for ish or adam and nephesh, in a number of instances, all on the ground of biblical usage. The second letter, 3 years later, November 1983, is in the context of a discussion of how to translate what is typically conveyed as manslayer in Joshua 20 and elsewhere. Orlinsky first establishes that manslayer is in fact the correct rendering. In response to those who would support some terminological distinction when a woman was involved as either perpetrator or victim, Orlinsky writes, there is something basic involved in the inclusive approach of these chapters as to the Bible generally. And this is a lack of respect and feeling for the Hebrew text. We all know that the Hebrew writers had ways and means of indicating inclusiveness. And in the Exodus and Joshua chapters involved, I am most doubtful that female manslayers were covered by these cities of refuge in the manner that male manslayers were. Inclusiveness here may constitute a rewriting of the law. In short, gender inclusivity and exclusivity were important, as were many other perspectives, both ancient and modern. A good translation committee, or Orlinsky averred, would know how to treat such issues in a way that was sensitive to today's readers and responsible with respect to the philological study of the ancient text. In other instances, Orlinsky insisted that the JPS revised text would correct older English renderings by mining the riches of the Jewish exegetical traditions. In such cases, he insistently made the point that the renderings that were within the text were correct because they were Jewish and because they were philologically appropriate. Jewish and scholarly. The most famous example is undoubtedly Genesis 1, verse 1 and following. Traditionally, in the beginning, God created heaven and the earth, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. In the New JPS, famously, when God began to create heaven and earth, and he went from God sweeping over the water. Now, there's a lot to talk about here. I want to talk about one of the points. Orlinsky wrote about this extensively. As he observed, not only did he follow Rashi, but it clearly shows what is also evident in philological analysis. Namely, that the Hebrew text tells us nothing about creation out of nothing, or creatio ex nihilo, or about the beginning of time. What then, according to our passage, constituted the first act of creation? If it wasn't the heaven, and it wasn't the earth, and it wasn't the darkness, it wasn't the deep. The first thing, Orlinsky said, that God did when he created the universe, and ancient men knew it, was to create light. In Isaiah 7:14, the 1917 Jewish version had thrown out the virgin who shouldn't have been there at all, and had, behold, the young woman shall conceive, and shall bear a son. The New Jewish version has, look, again, behold was old-fashioned, the young woman is with child and about to give birth to a son. So what the committee has done was to take these participles, and instead of thinking that the woman shall conceive as being in some distant future, put it into the imminent present. This is happening right before our eyes. Nonetheless, I will not see all changes made by the new JPS as equally positive. So, for example, in Ezekiel 2:1, and frequently throughout that book, Ezekiel is referred to in the traditional rendering as Son of Man. The new JPS, along with other versions, says, "O mortal." I don't get it. I mean, I understand it, but when I imagine God calling Ezekiel a mortal or Son of Man, I'm the Son of Man. In Proverbs 31:10, the new JPS committee decided, not I think very wisely, to have what a rare find is a capable wife, instead of the truly inspired wording of the 1917, a woman of valor who can find. And you don't find that awards are still being given to women of valor in the Jewish world. I don't know any being given to a capable wife. That may be. At this point, I believe that it is salutary to consider, albeit very briefly, how the translators of the JPS viewed their work. And here I'm quoting from a letter that Orlinsky wrote in October 1962. It's right as the translation is being published, to the editor of the Jewish Chronicle. What the press release on the new translation of the Torah meant to convey, Orlinsky wrote, was that our translation is not to be understood as constituting a revision of any prior or existing translation of the Bible, and two, that our committee of translators, quite deliberately to begin with, ignored the interpretation of the Hebrew text as found in the Septuagint, Targum, Syriac, Talmud, Vulgate, Sajja, Rashi, Ibn Ezra, David Kimke, the new JPS 1917, etc. We considered ourselves obligated to no prior interpretation of Scripture. Let me be more specific. The original attempt at a new draft for the new version was made directly from the Hebrew text, chapter by chapter. Only then, after the Hebrew text had had its say, began a laborious and detailed search through the older and newer translations and commentaries to determine what could be incorporated from them into the new version. The JPS Tanakh has had a distinguished publication record since its first appearance with the Torah in 1962 and the entire Tanakh in 1985. The English language text has appeared in its entirety or in parts in a number of different formats, which is fitting in acknowledging the fact that Jews use the Bible somewhat differently for worship, study, and presentation, celebrations, and holidays. My favorite format is the one that first appeared in 1999 with the Hebrew original and the JPS English version on facing pages. I especially like the format because it serves as a constant reminder that for Jews, the modern language renderings always point to the Hebrew original. The JPS Tanakh has had an ever wider and deeper influence within the Jewish community and for the larger community of scholars and worshippers for whom the Hebrew Bible is sacred writ. Thus, it formed the basis both for the first edition of Gunther Plaut's influential Reform commentary and for the current Torah commentary, Eitz Chaim, used in the conservative movement. The scholars who produced the widely praised JPS Torah commentary, Nachum Soderborn, Levine, Jacob Milburn, and Jeffrey Teague, used the Tanakh as their starting point, as did those involved in the extraordinarily valuable Jewish Study Bible, edited by Adele Berlin and Marcus V. Bretman. The JPS Tanakh in a somewhat revised form is also the basis for the thought-provoking contemporary version, edited by David E.S. Stein. To conclude, the Bible in its original and in translation should function as a springboard for further consideration on the part of readers. When this occurs, I speak of it as our interacting with the text. Thus, the biblical text is not inert, nor is it static. In the case of the JPS Tanakh, this interaction is facilitated, for at least some of us, by our personal knowledge of and experience with one or more of the translators responsible for this version. Orlinsky, as editor-in-chief of the Torah, exerted a decisive, and I would say positive influence on the rendering of the entire Hebrew Bible in this version. It is very difficult for me to believe that his death took place 20 years ago. But like the text he produced, Harry M. Orlinsky is someone who invited us, one and all, to interact with him. When I read the Tanakh, especially those sections that he and I discussed at length, I hear his voice and experience again the pleasure of being in the company of one of the greats. But I think I miss him most of all when I look at the competent but staid leadership of organizations like today's Society of Biblical Literature. It is in moments like this that my mind wanders back to November 1980, to the SBL's Centennial Banquet in Dallas, Texas. Appropriately, Orlinsky was a scheduled speaker at this event. As it turned out, his place in the program came at a particularly tense moment in the proceedings, arising from friction among some of the members of SBL leadership. Although I did not know it at the time, at that moment, he considered retreating from the podium. In his own words, who could possibly improve on them, he wrote, "I stood before a howling, wailing mic, an innocent sufferer, with no deceit in my mouth. But unlike the central character of Isaiah 53, who opened not his mouth, I had to open mine. I was among the hundreds in attendance who breathed a good deal easier as he regaled us with stories of his undergraduate pool shooting, the scheduling of which led him to take University of Toronto courses with Theophily Meek, a renowned biblical scholar who decisively influenced Orlinsky's academic interests in a similar direction. On another occasion, this time in writing, Orlinsky elaborated on his undergraduate career. And he wrote, "After completing 4 years at Parkdale Collegiate Institute, I opted for the 5th year there. Like so many other Jewish students who were poor and whose parents had come from Eastern Europe, instead of the 1st year at University College, which is part of the University of Toronto, because of the saving in tuition. I did well enough in my senior matriculation examinations to merit admission to the 2nd year of University College of General Arts. Because of the rare combination of snooker and meat, I repeated the 2nd year in honor Orientals." Parenthetically he writes, "This was before Near East was discovered. And by the time I received the BA degree in honor Orientals, I had 3 years of Arabic, 2 of Syrian, 3 of advanced Hebrew and Aramaic, etc." Parenthetically, he wrote, "Nowadays, one receives a Ph.D. degree for less." We will never again see another Harry Ellenson or Max Margolis or Moses Mendelssohn. But undoubtedly, we will someday come upon another Bible translation that bears its creator's genius in the way these 3 translators and others have put their marks on their respective versions. We are, if I may put it this way, blessed by the presence of such individuals within our community. Whether we agree or disagree with them, they succeed in making us better as individuals and as groups of individuals than we would have been without them. Thank you.
I was very privileged in the 1980s to study with Harry Orlinsky and then with the then young David Sperling, and still young at heart. And so how wonderful to have my other teacher of Bible to be able to respond to the remarks of Professor Greenspoon before we conclude our evening. And just a reminder, directly after this, you're invited to the Hanukkah reception and the kindling of the Hanukkah lights right here in the lobby. Professor Sperling.
Just a couple of brief remarks. It's hard to top President Greenspoon's presentation. You just heard that Professor Orlinsky went to the University of Toronto, and in the yearbook of his graduation year, they wrote about his sense of humor and his independent thought. I will get back to that in just a minute. When he, as you heard, he planned to study with Margolis, who died shortly before Dr. Orlinsky's arrival there. But he finished up, and he was also fortunate that he was able to study thanks to a cross-registration agreement with the University of Pennsylvania. He was also able to study with Professor James Montgomery, so that was a very useful part of his education. His first teaching job was at the Baltimore Hebrew Teachers College, and that had the great advantage, aside from paying the rent, it had the great advantage that he was able to attend the seminars given by William Foxwell Albright at Johns Hopkins. Albright was so impressed with the young Dr. Orlinsky that he wanted to bring him to Johns Hopkins University. The timing was terrible. With the war, the Second World War, the budget cuts made it impossible for Johns Hopkins to hire any new faculty. Now, fortunately, there was one very fortunate thing that happened. In 1943, Shalom Spiegel left the Jewish Institute of Religion, and that left a vacancy. So what happened was that Albright made contact with Stephen Wise, and that was how Professor Orlinsky got to what was then JIR, and of course, you heard after the merger, stayed here in 1950, and after the merger, and Professor Orlinsky spent his whole teaching career here, including being in this building. Among Professor Orlinsky's other public activities, he was president of the Society of Biblical Literature, was also instrumental in founding the International Organization of Septuagint and Cognate Studies. He was a great scholar of Septuagint. He was also very interested in Masoretic studies, and he founded the International Organization of Masoretic Studies. and he was also a founder of the American Friends of the Israel Exploration Society. Now, I wrote my first draft of what I was going to say tonight on the stationery of the Israel Exploration Society because I inherited Professor Orlinsky's office, and I inherited probably a ream of letterheads of the Israel Exploration Society, which on top of the letterheads give us the executive committee, which is Professor Orlinsky, the chairman, H.L. Ginsberg, Isaac Mendelson, and the honorary chairman were William Foxwell Albright and, of course, Professor Nelson Glick, who was the president of HUC. So, the location given for the Israel Exploration Society is 40 West 68th Street, an address that some of you will know. Now, so he was very much a public figure. Now, getting back to what they said about him in the yearbook at the University of Toronto and his scholarly independence, he regularly, consistently showed his independence of thought. For example, in his day, there was a theory of ancient Israel's origins called the Amphictyonic theory. It was propounded by a German scholar named Martin Noth, and according to that theory, ancient Israel arose as a sacral league, a sacred league centered around the sanctuary. And Orlinsky attacked, and this was virtually axiomatic when Orlinsky was writing about it, and he wrote a monograph to show, wrote a very long article to show it was completely imaginary. He also wrote a monograph to disprove the view that the book of Isaiah refers to a servant of the Lord who suffers for the sins of many. He also argued against the notion that the Hebrew prophets were universalists. So all these things would have taken accepted unless we challenged. As a serious text critic, he was able to demonstrate the inferiority of the St. Mark's Isaiah scroll, which most scholars have declared superior to the standard Masoretic text. And as an aside, he also denied that there was such a thing as one Masoretic text. When I first came here from Barnard, I told Professor Orlinsky about a doctoral exam that had been one of my last official duties at Barnard. It was across the street at Columbia. At that exam, the student had referred to the JPS Torah translation as Orlinsky's Torah. So when I told him the story, it was in his office, he immediately reached into his very large cartoon files. He used to keep files of cartoons, and retrieved a cartoon from the Yiddish press, and that cartoon depicted a stereotypical ultra-Orthodox Jew pushing away a copy of the new JPS Torah translation. A stereotypical sanctimonious fanatic to which Dr. Orlinsky and also my family referred to as a HUC. And so that cartoon depicts this HUC pushing away a copy of the JPS Torah, and the caption in Yiddish read, "Es nit mikabel Orlinsky's Torah." This one is, he's not accepting Orlinsky's Torah. Now, there's no little irony in the fact that many a yeshiva student, the yeshiva bocher, who would have belonged to this circle of Orlinsky refuseniks, studied the Bible commentary of Rashi with the aid of an English translation, which Orlinsky was the co-author. So many yeshiva students used Orlinsky's translation of the Rashi commentary to work on Rashi. The Toronto Yearbook was also right about a sense of humor. I remember back in 1986, during the cocktail hour before dinner of the Society of Biblical Literature at a hotel in Jerusalem, and I was standing in a small group that Professor Orlinsky was regaling with stories, as he always did. He was an unbelievable raconteur. Now, one of the guests, who also could have been in this cartoon, stereotypical New York, asked our group who was the mashgiach, that is, who was the kosher supervisor for this hotel. Without skipping a beat, Orlinsky said, "I am." And this, of course, induced immediate panic on the face of the question. On another occasion, after reading his article on the term virgin in the Hebrew Bible, I told him that I was glad to be working with the world's foremost authority on virginity? And he answered, I did, but that was a long time ago. Now, while we're on the subject of virgins, Professor Greenspoon has already alluded to this. This being the Christmas season, you're all familiar with the Christian story of the virgin birth of Jesus as related in the book of Matthew chapter 1. And verse 22 of that chapter reads, Now all this took place to fulfill the words spoken by the Lord through the prophet, quote, The virgin will conceive and bear a son, you shall call him Emmanuel. And this, of course, is the verse from Isaiah 7:14. Professor Orlinsky, who was the only Jewish scholar, as you've heard on the translation committee of the Protestant Revised Standard Version, was actually able to convince the committee to translate the Isaiah verse correctly. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and name him Emmanuel. So not only did it make it into the JPS, but it made it into both versions of the RSV. And Professor Orlinsky, as he told me, was very happy with that result, naturally. But his arguments were not theological, they were philological. As you heard from Professor Greenspoon, Orlinsky did not really care about the personal perspective of a Bible scholar, female or male, Gentile or Jewish. He cared about competence. There is no doubt in my mind that if Professor Orlinsky had thought that the Hebrew of Isaiah 7:14 was indeed a prediction of a virgin birth, he would have let it stand. Professor Orlinsky was not concerned with the question, what does the Bible mean to me, but what does the Bible mean? If I may be pardoned a repurposing of the term used by that graduate student on the doctoral exam several years ago, the question, what did the Bible mean, that was really the heart of Orlinsky's Torah. Thank you.